Welcome to Your Next Tech Startup. I'm host Isabel Rasmussen and founder of Processo Talent. Today, I'm having two friends on the show. Kartik, I recruited out of Salesforce into a startup. He and I then joined another startup where I recruited Levester into that startup, and Kartik interviewed him. I'll have both of you introduce yourself quickly, and then we'll go through the experience that you guys had with interviews, then training to interviewing, and then Levester kind of taking on that interview process. So, quick intros. Kartik, you want to start?
Kartik Lakshminarayanan, currently CTO of Sanvira.net. Uh, Isabel hijacked me away from Salesforce in 2017 for a startup, and we've been friends, colleagues, and friends again. And I'm glad to be on this podcast.
Thank you, Kartik. Levester, when did I
I,
hijack you into a startup world?
no, not necessarily. I'm Levester. I joined with Kartik and Isabel at a startup, and we've kind of just been close ever since then.
Yeah, I was telling Kartik the other day, Levester, that I think you're one of the few people I've actually seen in person after the pandemic.
Yeah. And I
So,
remember you did not want to go to a chain restaurant.
yeah, I know, but we did.
Sweet memories.
So, uh, we were interviewing for a senior full stack engineer. Is that right?
We were interviewing for a full stack engineer. I remember that vividly when you and I had the conversation, saying that is it a senior or not, and we wanted somebody who was a full stack software engineer,
Okay. So, right, could be like mid stage, not quite at senior.
not required a senior.
Okay. And so the first interview that the two of you had was by phone. So talk us through that. What was the intention of that first interview that you conducted, Kartik?
So if I were to step back, we were hiring for a team that was forming. I was team
Mhm.
member number two to hire, and we were building out some application that needed somebody to come in, be nimble, be hands-on, and get things done without having to over-architect or over-design something. Now, with that in mind, we said, let's talk about what skill sets do we need. Do we need somebody who is 10, 15 years in the industry with a lot of experience, or do we need somebody who can come in, hit the ground running? And we said, let's find somebody who's junior to mid, somebody who's able to and willing to do that job. And the way I usually conduct interviews is I look for particular skills on how people talk about code. How do they write code? I do not emphasize on things like quicksort, things like bubble sort, things like data structures. The usage of data structures or sorting algorithms or efficiencies in a conversation comes about organically. My first conversation with Levester was, here's a whiteboard, as in here's a text pad, let's write this code, here's a small problem I'd like to solve. I always emphasize on asking candidates questions which would be relevant for them when they join the team. And I picked one that I was actively solving, and I said, here's a particular business problem I'm solving. How would you do it? So he went about writing the code. We went back and forth. It was, again, I was language agnostic because I just wanted to see how Levester approached the problem. I wanted to see how he would solve it. And I was pretty explicit saying it doesn't matter. I don't care if your code runs or not. We went about having a good enough conversation about how he would solve the problem, which he did. And then he said, how would you optimize this?
Mhm.
But this gave me enough signal to say, let's have you come in person and we'll do an interview which is more detailed and which would be more, uh, which would go deep into his technical skills.
And Levester, one of the things that happens in these interviews is there's no opportunity for feedback. Now we have this opportunity to talk about it Granted, it's quite a few years later. Curious kind of what you remember from that interview, what you liked about it. Would there have been any feedback to Kartik on how that interview could have gone better?
Um, as someone who has interviewed quite a lot, especially recently,
Yeah.
I think what stood out to me about that interview process, like Kartik said, was that it wasn't really focused on like a specific data structure or any kind of like textbook collegiate thing that you have to memorize and be prepared to spit out, regurgitate. It was definitely much more about the process. How do you think? How can we work together to solve this problem? One of the things that I really liked about Kartik's interview was that it wasn't like, here's a problem, here's your solution, I'll sit here and wait and watch you type for 30 minutes. It was very
Mhm.
much interactive. We were going back and forth. It was more of a conversation than it was like an interview by firing squad or whatever. So I think that was one of
Just
the
out
things
of
that
curiosity, like what percentage of the time do you get that interview where
very
it's
infrequently.
that it is a conversation?
Yeah. A lot of times
Really?
for me, it comes off as being just like, here's the problem. Um, do you have any questions? Yes or no? And then, okay, go ahead. And a lot of times I just try to remember to keep talking and talking and talking so they can understand what I'm thinking. But it's very much more or less just me working on the problem and talking. And if I have a question, I ask the question. But it's very much not conversational a lot of the time.
Oh, I always assumed when I'm scheduling and like a live interview that there's a ton of back and forth. No.
The times I do get it, it's very much appreciated because it's a huge weight off my shoulders. It feels like much less like I'm um, like interviewing for my life as opposed to just like, let's try and see if this works, if this is the good fit. Let's figure this out together. And so it's definitely a lot less stressful in those kind of interviews. But a lot of the times, especially at some of the bigger companies, it's just, here's the problem. Do you have any questions? Nope. Okay, go ahead. You got like 25 minutes left. And it's like, okay, I guess we'll do this.
Huh. So Kartik, I'm curious, where did you develop that interviewing technique?
Part of it trauma
Yeah.
from going through a whole lot of FANG companies. Some are very interesting anecdotes that I could share at a later date, but some of it is more about empathy. And here's where I'm going with it, which is interviewing is one of the hardest events for any human being.
Yeah.
By definition, by its nature, it is going to be stressful because that person is being assessed as a pass or a fail. There's no gray area. That's
Yeah.
that's one aspect. The second aspect, the way I look at it is, I do not want to make the candidates' lives any harder.
Mhm.
But more importantly, I would rather have the candidate succeed. I want to set the candidate for success because it saves me a lot of time. That's little bit of selfish part of me saying, I don't want to interview 20 different candidates. If I get a
Mhm.
good candidate, I try one or try two. That's enough. That's good enough for me. So I always aspire and strive to make the candidates uh, experience as less painful as possible.
So I'm incredibly surprised by, granted I don't conduct technical interviews. So that it is kind of like a 25-minute or whatever void of
Mhm.
conversation that is common. So so let's make the assumption, I think the three of us agree that an interview should be more of a back and forth than a watching and judging experience. And so I'm going to jump ahead, Kartik,
Mhm.
and Levester's on the team now, and you're training him on how to interview. So I'm curious what you did in regards to training him so that he was creating a more empathetic interview experience. And Levester, how much of it was new and uncomfortable to potentially not do the 25-minute? I'm making an assumption that when you interviewed other people, you kind of did the 25-minute void. Um, like, how easy was it for you to adjust how you interviewed to be more interactive? So let's dig into that.
So the way I look at it, and again, I remember the conversation very well with Levester saying, I said, why don't you pair up with me so that you can start doing some pre-screening and some interviews? It's more about not training. It is just watch how I do it.
Mm-hmm.
But I'd also said that the watching is not going to be passive. It's going to be more active. So before we did, I think 3 or 4 interviews together before I cut him loose. And for each of them, we did a pre-brief. I would say, here's the candidate, here's a problem, this is the one that you've seen, the one you solved. I'm going to take this problem again, and here's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for how the person tries to solve the problem. How do they approach it? Do they just start writing code, which would have been fine with me? Do they ask questions? I also tell him explicitly saying that I leave some requirements ambiguous. I want to see the people ask questions. So
Mm-hmm.
these are some of the pre-brief that I did with him, and I said, let's get into an interview. We go to it, we run through the whole rigmarole. And I also say at any point you want to jump in, feel free to jump in. But I also set up enough space for him to say, what questions do you have for the candidate? And that's an explicit question that needs to be asked. It's like handing a baton in a relay race.
Mm-hmm. So, Levester, how was that for you? Was it a big adjustment?
It was an adjustment. It was definitely something I hadn't done before. So being able to kind of see the prep that Kartik goes through in the interview was definitely, I don't say eye-opening, but it was informational for me to be able to take that and then incorporate into my own style going forward. But yeah, and Kartik, if I'm not mistaken, we had a pre-brief and we had a post-debrief as well.
Yes.
So we would go in, we would talk about it before we went into the interview. We would go into the interview, and then we would come out. We would talk about the candidate, and then Kartik would give me feedback on how I was in that interview, so that I could get live feedback about how. I think there was one point that I made a comment or something, and Kartik was like, "I wouldn't say that in the interview," and I was like, "Noted. Okay."
I'm curious, do you remember what the comment
I
was?
do not. I'm
Um,
just really.
I I remember that comment, and again, I'm not spilling the beans here. It was more of uh, Levester was trying to get to the root of the answer, saying, "Give me the answer," as opposed to let guide the horse to the water kind of mechanism. And I was
Mhm.
like, what I was trying, what the conversation with Levester out there was, let's try to get the candidate to realize what the right thing or the wrong thing is, instead of saying, "What did you do wrong?"
Okay. So the comment had to make the candidate feel like they had done something wrong.
No, the candidate
No.
was having the candidate to figure out what they would do differently. Right or wrong has a negative or a positive connotation. For me, it was
Okay.
more around, here's where your answer is not optimal. How would you change it?
Okay. Okay, so go through again what's the wrong way to do that and what's the right way to do that in a scenario?
Okay, so here's a problem. They write the code, and they say, here's what I've done. You gave me a problem. I solved it. I
Yeah.
know that it is wrong. Leviston knows that it is wrong.
Okay.
It would be easy for either of us to point out the mistake, saying that it's wrong and what's wrong.
Okay.
Instead, what I do is, okay, you wrote a piece of code and you think you're confident about it being right, and they say yes. Okay, let's run it through some scenarios. And how would you test it? How would you test it is an open-ended question, but tells me a lot about the candidate, how they think about testing their own code.
Okay.
Being developers, I am always optimistic of the code I write. Can I take a step back and look at the code and say, here's something that could go wrong? And that's what I want to bring out of the candidate. So it was a
Okay.
question where Levester saying that I don't think it'll give the output that you think it does. Not the exact words, but that's the kind of message that we went about. Instead of saying that, let's test it out. Let's test out this input. How would it work?
Okay. Now, I'm going to make an assumption that we passed on that candidate.
Actually, yes.
Okay. The second question I have is it even possible? I know, Kartik, you're trying to create more opportunity for the candidate. If at that point, like the solution is wrong, is there a way to then not get rejected in that interview?
Levester, do you want to take this? I'll respond to it in a bit. I know what my answer is going to be.
So for me, I think it comes down to Kartik's approach of the conversational aspect, where let's run your code through some scenarios and see how it performs, right? So if the solution is wrong and you come up with good test cases to test your solution, most likely you're going to find that it doesn't behave the way you think it does. So
Right.
what that tells you about the candidate is they write code, but they're able to think about it in such a way that it's not just, oh, I wrote this, it should do this, and you pick some surface level test cases that are going to pass every single time, and you go, yep, it's good. But if you're able to come up with really good test cases, like, well, what if I put for instance, if you have like a mathematical function, right, and say, well, what if I put negative numbers? What if I put unreal numbers? You put in inputs that you don't expect to get and see what your code does. That kind of gives you more confidence in your solution. And I think what we were looking for there was your solution's incorrect, and can you have the right test cases to confidently say that it is correct so that you can catch it when it's not correct.
Okay.
Does that make
So
sense?
if they had come up with really strong test cases and the code itself was not correct and they recognize that the code itself is not correct from the test cases, then they can pass the interview.
I would say so.
Uh, I have a different approach than Levester. Here's where he and I digress.
Okay.
To me, a wrong solution is not an automatic rejection. To
Hmm.
me, a right solution is not an automatic selection. It's I look at multiple factors. How do you go about writing the code? How do you go about thinking about the solution? What questions do you ask? What corner cases do you look for? Uh, I want to give the candidate enough opportunities to redeem themselves if they made a mistake. And if a candidate says, oops, I was wrong, that's a big plus point because the ability to accept mistakes is a big part of the team culture that I was trying to build.
Yeah.
Then we also said, okay, fine, you can write code, you can design. What can you do to make your code, which is correct, perform better? One of the things a mentor of mine, a manager of mine, always says, push the candidate until you find an answer where they say, I don't know. And that's something that I strive to do with the candidates, saying, I'm going to keep, again, one of the things that I do not know how well it works, but I'm explicit saying that I'm going to keep asking you questions. And at some point, you feel that you do not have an answer, don't worry about it, but I want you to be clear about when you do not have an answer. To me, it was about creating a safe space for the candidate to say, I don't know.
Right. Yeah, that's a great. I mean, I think the creating the safe space is something that um in interviews is so critical, and oftentimes like I'll see in a debrief, an interviewer is talking through things and, oh, well, the candidate didn't do this, the candidate didn't do this. And I'm always kind of oftentimes wondering to myself, well, did you create a space that the candidate felt comfortable asking questions? As interviewers, how you create that safe space. Levester, what were the key things that you had to change about how you interviewed and what you've noticed as a result?
Well, kind of just going back to earlier, right? I think the biggest thing was just changing your approach from let me see if this candidate is good versus let's have an interaction with this candidate and then afterwards assess the back and forth, right? I think in a lot of interviews, especially early on, it was always about here's the solution you give them or here's the question you give them, and then kind of just go through that process, let them solve it, and then see how they perform. And I think having your criteria be more than just can they solve this leak code question that I gave them makes the interview more meaningful on both sides because you get better insights. The candidate feels like it's not just like going through the ringer, so it's probably a little less stressful if that's possible. What I've taken away from my time studying under Kartik was trying to create a space where it's not so much can you solve leak code questions that you've been grinding for however long because you're interviewing, and can you solve a real world problem, and if you don't know how to solve the real world problem, do you know how to ask for help? I think that's the important thing that you really look for in candidates are people that are not only competent, but they also know how to admit when they've been wrong and they know how to ask for help.
One of
Okay.
the things that I've learned interviewing candidates with Levester, there was this one time where I took my approach of saying, "Let me help you get to an answer." We did a debrief after the interview, and it was like cut to the chase. That was those are the exact words he used. So to me, it's not about just guiding the candidate to an answer, but sometimes you just have to say this. It's irredeemable. Let's cut to the chase. Let's give them an answer. Let's see what they do next. So that's a balance that I struggle with every single time, and it was one of the things where that feedback helped me temper my future interviews.
Okay, so let me get some clarification there. It was the candidate was like stuck
Yes.
and okay, and so it was like, okay, let's just help them get unstuck, like give
No,
them
it
the
was like
answer.
the candidates were stuck, and I tried multiple ways to point out to them that they were wrong. They just couldn't see why they were wrong,
Okay.
and it was one of those cases where I over-indexed on trying to get them to walk to an answer instead of saying, "Here's why you're wrong. Let's see how you would solve it."
I deal with this when I interview people. I'll ask a question, like, tell me about an interesting project that you've worked on in the last year. And they
Mhm.
give me a 1 to 2 sentence answer. Um, and I'm looking for more than that. And so I dig, ask them more. And then sometimes I do get a great answer out of it.
Mhm.
But then there is this part of, okay, well, at what point is you're digging so much that you're almost like not letting them be like who they are. But then there's that other side of it that's just interviewing is so awkward and uncomfortable for
Mhm.
people that you should do as much as you can to help them. But there is that how do you hold that balance there?
Exactly. And to one point is, even though I say that writing perfect code is not something that I look for, but I still want to see if they can write correct code. There were a
Mhm.
couple of adjustments that I made. The first one was instead of having them do a live coding test, I send them an exercise saying, "Here's a GitHub repository. Make changes to it, write code, push it back to us, and in a couple of hours, we give you 2 hours to finish it." It was 2 hours was more than enough time, and I've done the test myself to say in check and finish in 30 minutes. Levester, anyone you do it at the same time, I ensure that my team does it before I send it out to them. That, and then we can go and say have a conversation about how you implemented it and why. That's something that helps the candidate implement something in low pressure situation without having somebody to watch. But the second thing, Isabel, that you and I did, which was send out an email with expectations in an interview, where we draft out saying, when you come in for an interview, here's what we are looking for. Here are the something that you will be evaluated on. We did not give the candidate the questions that you're going to ask them, but
Mhm.
we did tell them what the expectations were going to be explicitly. We did not do that for Levester. I remember that very well, but we did that for a whole bunch of other candidates that we interviewed and we hired, saying that
Yeah,
these are the expectations, these are the questions, these are the areas that we would cover.
yeah. I wish I had that email.
I
Yeah, I
have it.
forgot about that. You do? If you have it, send it to me. Okay, I always love talking to the both of you. I think technical interviews are overall like a broken process that great engineers don't do well on those interviews. One in what I think the data is like 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 times. So, as my last question for each of you, of the technical interviews that you either conduct, if there was a particular interview that you think is the best style of conducting a technical interview, what's your favorite one? And then we'll wrap it up.
Levester.
I'll go first. Um, So I think it's a coin toss between the conversational one that we started off talking about here, and the other one being at a different company when I interviewed for them. They sent me, like Kartik said, the GitHub where I was able to do the code on my own time away from it. And then we basically got on a call and kind of talked through what's your solution, why did you do it the way you did it, would you make improvements, right? Kind of going back and forth, kind of just picking your brain about how you did that. I think those two are probably the least stressful and most enjoyable interviews, just because, like I said, they take you kind of out of that firing squad feeling into just like, okay, I'm actually not just being graded, I'm also getting a chance to kind of see how they interact with people on a day to day basis. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's a great point. Kartik?
My favorite instance was when I actually rejected a client, is not client, a candidate, and that candidate actually sent me an email afterwards saying, "Thank you for telling me why and what. You did give me an opportunity to ensure that that I would succeed, but it's helpful when you do it the way you did it." And I still have that email and I treasure it. It's not about making people feel bad about a rejection, but also trying to help them figure out what went wrong and why. To me, that's my most favorite incident of an interview.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the feedback is something that doesn't happen. I wish there was some platform. I don't know if when you're actually interviewing for a company is the way to do it, but if there are opportunities where people can practice interviewing and being interviewed where there is genuine, honest feedback that helps each of them grow.
Understood.
Yeah. Okay. Well, again, thank you both for coming on, and thank you everyone else who listened. And hopefully, this helps more people who are interviewing think about the way that they're interviewing and do it in a way that is more supportive to the candidate experience.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Thank
Been a
you.
pleasure.
Pleasure.